All right, starting over, but I don't think I'll introduce myself again. They heard that, right?
We hope.
No, we didn't.
All right, so here's the overview I talked about. All right, so I'm starting over to say that we benefit from the environment every day in multiple ways. And these benefits are collectively known as ecosystem services. They include recreation, such as hunting, fishing, and hiking, but also things that sustain us, like food from agriculture, clean air, and clean water. But today I'm going to be focusing on the ecosystem service of pollination. So pollination is essentially plant reproduction. It's when something like wind or an animal moves pollen from the male part of a plant to the female part, thus letting the plant set seed. So possibly the best known animal pollinators are bees, but there's many other groups, such as butterflies and hummingbirds, but also groups that you may not think about, like flies and beetles, or even mammals like bats. So I mentioned that pollination is an ecosystem service, meaning that it benefits people. So some of these benefits are that about 90% of the world's flowering plants depend on animal pollinators. And that includes 4,000 out of the 5,000 native Texas plants. It also includes about 75% of our global crop species. And this is especially a lot of those crops that make our diets more interesting, like fruits, vegetables, and nuts. And in all, this pollination service contributes about $200 to $500 billion to the global economy. So probably the best known insect pollinators are the honeybees. Everything's good? So rather than repeat myself, I'm just going to flip through. Ecosystem services, here's some pollinators, here's some pictures of the fruits. Honeybees, I guess I'll start here. So you probably are all familiar with honeybees. They're social. They have colonies up to 50,000 individuals. But something important to keep in mind is that they're not native to the United States. They originated in Europe, and they are essentially livestock. So it's a $15 billion per year industry in the United States. We're still good?
As far as I know, I had two, they were here in two audio.
Great. But they have been declining since 2005, which has led to a lot of interest in other pollinators. So this is the group I'm interested in, the wild native bees. So there's about 20,000 species of bees globally, including 4,000 species in North America, and at least 1,000 species in Texas alone. And they are extremely diverse. So now everyone on Zoom can see all these pretty pictures of bees. You can see they are all different shapes, sizes, and colors. And they're associated with different habitats and different flowers. And many of these are solitary, which means that only one bee lives per nest. And something else to know is that they're often more or equally efficient as honeybees for pollination. So to understand how to conserve these insect pollinators, we need to know a bit more about their biology. So starting with food, pollinators are, of course, dependent on flowers for a lot of their food, including nectar, which makes up their energy and carbohydrates, and pollen, which constitutes their protein, which they use for growth and raising their offspring. Pollinators also need to gather salts, which they do by visiting mud, or also going to the sweat of animals. So maybe some of you have experienced sweat bees in the past. When they do that, they're just trying to gather salt and nutrients. And then a lot of other pollinators also require different foods when they're larvae. For example, caterpillars need very specific host plants, while other pollinators like wasps may need other insects, and a lot of flies and beetles will need dead plants. So a lot of attention when we're talking about pollinator conservation, a lot of the attention is given to pollinator food because that's the most visible thing to us. But they also need shelter, and it's unclear how much their shelter is a limited resource. So pollinators, again, you might think of honeybees living in colonies, but the vast majority are actually solitary. And about 70% of bees and many of our other pollinator species actually nest in the ground, but have very specific requirements in terms of the sorts of ground and soil composition that they can nest in. They'll also nest in cavities in wood. So depending on the species, they'll live in stems or holes in trees, old rodent burrows, and maybe people's houses. And then beetles and flies often will nest in leaf litter on the ground or on living vegetation. So this drawing shows the life stages of the solitary bee. You can see that for much of her life, she's actually living underground. She really only comes out and flies around to collect food and to mate. So many of these solitary species are only emerged for a month or two out of the year. Insect shelter requirements are not really well understood yet, but we do know that having habitat that provides the right type of shelter is absolutely critical. So some of the reasons that they need good shelter is to moderate their temperature and the moisture in their nests, to hide from predators, and to lay eggs, rear young, and survive the winter. So what does this actually look like in a real landscape? So this is one example from our work of a landscape that we consider to be really good for pollinators. You can see that there's diverse habitats here. There's grassland in front, there's trees and some forests in the back. So that provides a variety of different nest materials for bees. There's exposed soil and grass thatch, which are places where some species can nest. And then there's also a diversity of wildflowers and high abundance. So when we're trying to restore pollinators, this is essentially what we're trying to get at. So now I just want to talk a bit about what threats pollinators are facing. So you may have read that the world is currently in a biodiversity crisis with really massive declines in animal species across the world. And insects have been hit really hard with these declines. This graph is from a paper published in Science in 2014. And they found that there was actually a 45% decline in global insect abundance over only 40 years, with some of the greatest declines being experienced by a lot of our pollinator groups. So the native pollinators are in dramatic decline due to a number of different factors. So they're being hit by a number of different diseases, and as well as overuse of pesticides, which has gotten a lot of media attention. And they're also being affected already by shifts in the climate, which are really rapidly changing the environments that they live in. But probably the most significant cause of their declines is the loss of their natural habitat. There are many drivers of these losses, including rapid urbanization, shown here as the change from ranchland to urban areas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's a little bit hard to make out, but essentially in just about 40 years, this entire region has filled out, become very urban. Then they've also experienced declines due to agricultural intensification, turning a high-quality prairie into a monoculture that doesn't have many resources for pollinators. They've lost habitat due to resource exploitation like mining. And then something that is really relevant here in Texas is that they've lost a lot of habitat due to overgrazing, which leads to the loss of a lot of the plant species that they depend on and changes to the soil communities that they live in. So this map shows the extent of tallgrass prairie pre-European settlement compared to the current prairie. You can see that about 99% of the prairie in the United States has been lost. And You can't really see the prairies here in the second map in Texas. There are still prairies here, of course, but they're much smaller and fragmented across the landscape, where historically it would have extended throughout the entire state. Okay, so now I've depressed you all talking about threats to pollinators, but don't worry, we're all working towards bringing them back and working on their conservation. So the best way to conserve pollinators is by conserving the habitat that supports them. So what this habitat is depends on where in the world you are. So in Texas, prairies and grassland were historically very important for providing the food and shelter resources that I've been talking about so far. This map shows all of the ecoregions across Texas, and I'm not going to go through what they all are, but the basic take home here is that most of these ecoregions were largely comprised of a mosaic of forest and grassland. And especially in central Texas, there was just a huge extent of grassland. So it means that grassland within Texas was really important for these pollinator populations. Grasslands are really interesting in that if there isn't fairly frequent disturbance, they actually become forest, become a totally different habitat type. And forests tend to support fewer pollinators than grasslands. So around here in Texas, historically, there are two major factors that helped maintain the grassland. The first is grazing by large mammals, including the antelope and bison, which would thin out the vegetation. The second was fire, which was historically a really important force across all of Texas. So this map shows how often areas would burn before major fire suppression that occurred in the past century or so. And you can see that across most of the state, fire was pretty frequent. In some areas, it even occurred every 1 to 5 years. So these reds indicate that a given area was likely to burn at least every 15 years or so across most of Texas. And these were not huge fires. They're not wildfires the way you might think of them. They were small and patchy because there wasn't the amount of thatch buildup that there is now due to the fire suppression. So these were mostly small fires. They didn't consume the whole state. And there were two main causes of these fires as well. The first is lightning strikes, which would mostly happen in the summer. And then second were the native tribes that would actually go in and maintain the land by setting the fires. Knowing these historical habitats is super important for restoring habitat now to rescue these threatened ecosystems. It allows the restoration of the land, which is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So to restore habitat across Texas, we have a number of tools that we use. The first, I'm sure you're all very familiar with as the Native Plant Society, but it's seeding with native plants. So the goal here, so first going in and clearing the land and then seeding with plants that historically would have been there. So the goal here is to reinstate habitat structure, but then specifically for the pollinators, it increases floral abundance and reintroduces those food resources and important host plants across the landscape that have been lost. The second strategy is prescribed burning, because again, fire would have historically been a really important force in these landscapes. So prescribed burning removes woody vegetation, it increases forb abundance and flowering, and it creates bare ground, allowing new flowers to grow and also creating that nest space for the pollinators.
What is forb?
Oh, forb are flowering plants. So just as important as the tool that you use is how you implement it. So this is a really huge topic, but there's a few things to keep in mind when you're planning to manage land. So the first is the timing and the intensity of these disturbances. The second is the area of the habitat that you're restoring, whether it's large enough and where it's located in the landscape, and how diverse that habitat is. And then In addition, something that people talk about a lot is applying a management tool to only a part of a site at a time to allow the whole area to recover, to not just wipe things out, and to mimic the historic conditions as well. So all the recommendations we just talked about are being applied in areas across Texas. So governmental groups and conservation groups are restoring land, providing food and shelter for pollinators. So if you're interested in any of the specific recommendations, I would recommend looking at this guide by Texas Parks and Wildlife, which breaks down some of these recommendations and plant lists for encouraging pollinators. Also, Fish and Wildlife also runs a partner program that helps landowners restore and enhance wildlife habitat on their land. So this brings us to our research. I mentioned that the Texas Parks and Wildlife has released this guide to management and is giving out formal recommendations for how to restore pollinators across the land. But these recommendations are based on expert opinion and small-scale studies rather than a comprehensive study looking at these recommendations across real-world working landscapes. So what our lab has done is partnered with the Texas Parks and Wildlife to take some of these recommendations and create an experiment at the spatial scales that would actually matter for pollinators to see what they can really do in the real world. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And this project has two main goals. So the first is to simply see whether managing grassland habitat helps pollinators, because some of these actions can be expensive and labor intensive. And then second, do the different management tools have the same impacts? Because we want to tailor the management to the land itself. So we have a team across several different universities for this work, including Dr. Eleanor Lichtenberg at the University of North Texas, my advisor, Dr. Shalini Jha at UT Austin, Dr. Kristen Baum at Oklahoma State University, and then myself as the postdoc running the project on the ground. And for this work, we selected a large ecoregion that historically would have been maintained by fire, but has seen a great deal of degradation. So we work in the Cross Timbers ecoregion, which is this area that extends from north of Austin all the way up into southern Kansas. And historically, this area would have been a mix of really dense forest in a mosaic with kind of sparse prairie that is kind of a savanna grassland. And historically, it would have been managed by a number of native tribes, including the Wichita, the Comanche, and the Takawa. And fire would have occurred across this region about every 3 to 10 years. So fire would have been a major force here. So across this region, we reached out to Fish and Wildlife, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers, and state conservation groups, as well as private landowners, because we were interested in working on land that is owned by parties that would actually be interested in doing restoration. So we wanted this to be as close to real life as possible. Then we picked 10 sites across that entire ecoregion. And we created a landscape scale experiment at each of these sites. So we had 4 treatments. 2 treatments we just had prescribed burns. So 1 treatment that's 5 acres here in orangey red, and 1 that's 50 acres. Then we had another treatment that was a 5-acre burn combined with targeted planting of some target plant species that are especially good for pollinators. And then we also selected a 5-acre control so we could compare these treatments over time to see how they would differ from an untreated plot. So here's a photo from one of our burns in 2018. And you can see that the grass was getting pretty thick. and needed to be thinned out to promote flower growth. Here's a photo of our actual wildflower seed mix, and an example of our actually seeding it into the ground. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to show the seed mix that we used for restoring this land. So since this was all aimed specifically at restoring pollinators, we selected 3 flowering plants for each season in the spring, summer, and fall. And for any of you that know the scientific names, I'm sorry if some of these are outdated. I realized that the other day. And then also we selected 2 milkweed species to encourage monarch butterflies and other insects. So we did all this restoration. Well, we selected the sites in 2017. We did restoration in 2018. And then we've been monitoring the habitat for the resources and for the changes in the pollinator communities since 2017. So before restoration and post-restoration, to see what our restoration actions are actually accomplishing. And so to do this, we are going out once every season in the spring, summer, and fall. And we use these 1x1 meter squares that are gridded that we lay on the ground, and then we just count and identify every flower species in them to get an idea of what is actually in the site. We repeat this 45 times per plot, so we get a good measure of what's actually in the site. And then we're also recording all sorts of other things like the composition of the ground cover, so looking at nest and habitat, also looking at things like invasive grasses. And in case you were thinking that this was really easy, a lot of our plots look like this in the summer. So it's kind of hard to identify and count every single one of those flowers. So then we would also measure pollinators once a year during the summer. And unlike many studies that just look at the bees, we decided to look at the entire pollinator community to see how it was changing. So we looked at bees and wasps, but also beetles, flies, and butterflies. We collected pollinators in a few different ways. So the main method is through netting. So we would walk through our plots in a standardized area, and we would net all the pollinators we could off of flowers. And then we also used this really common method called pan traps, which is a passive trapping method often used for collecting bees, where we put little colorful bowls full of water on the ground and bees just fly in. They think they're flowers. It's, I don't know, it's very simple, but it works. And then we also, across all the sites, would search for milkweeds and look for monarch eggs to see how our restoration was affecting this larval resource. So I mentioned that we've been doing this study since 2017. So 2017 was before the treatment, and then we've been collecting data for 4 years post-treatment. Unfortunately, today I can only talk about the first 3 years of the project because of COVID. We have been going out and collecting the data, but it takes so much to enter it and to identify the specimens that we've been falling behind in the last couple of years. So in those 3 years, we collected about 15,000 specimens, 15,000 specimens. Representing about 400 different pollinator species. So this is very, very diverse given that we're only visiting each site once per year. And out of these, the most common groups were the flies and the bees as compared to the beetles and butterflies. Okay, so I'm first going to tell you a little bit about what we found in these sites pre-restoration. So we looked at these sites, we did the same methods, went out and collected the pollinators. We asked, does habitat differentially affect different pollinator groups? And this is pretty representative of what our sites looked like before restoration, often very full of grass, often with mesquite and maybe some juniper, and very few flowers. So this graph shows the number of insects that we collected on the y-axis and the proportion of bare ground on the x-axis. And this is pretty interesting because it showed exactly what we would expect. So based on what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, that bees require bare ground for nesting, you would expect higher amounts of bare ground to lead to more nesting bees. And that's exactly what we found. Something that we didn't expect was a decrease in the flies. And likely that's because with more bare ground, you're getting less litter and less living plant matter, which makes up less space for the flies to live. So this indicates some sort of trade-off between those groups. And when we looked at the number of bees and wasps versus the number of flower species, we also found what we would expect to see. So before restoration, sites with more flowers also had more bees and wasp species. So in all, what this tells us is that at least before restoration, the communities are responding the way we would expect them. They're responding positively to bare ground as well as to flowers. So then the question becomes, after restoration, are these resources actually being increased across these landscapes? Yeah, that's this question. So before I jumped into the results here, I wanted to show you an empty graph to explain it first. So on all of these next few graphs, I'm going to be showing the response, in this case, the bare ground on the y-axis, plotted by the year on the x-axis. And remember that anything in 2017 is pre-restoration, so we would expect them all to be similar. And and then, sorry, the 4 different treatments are shown with 4 different colors, with the 5-acre burn in red, the 50-acre burn in red but dotted, the seed and burn in yellow, and the control in blue. And so when you're looking at these graphs, look at the difference between these treatments within a single year, rather than between the years, which can be impacted by other things like the weather. So this is just to remind you that restoration happened in early 2018. Okay, so this first graph shows that burning increased bare ground availability. So if you look in 2017, all the sites had relatively similar levels of bare ground, just not very much, likely because these areas had not been burned for a long time. But in 2018, following the burn treatments, the sites did exactly what you would expect. There was a major increase in the amount of bare ground. But surprising to us, in 2019, already in 2 years post restoration, enough plants grew that it brought the amount of bare ground back to comparable amounts to what we saw in 2017. So this graph shows the effect of burning on the native flowers in all the different treatments. And so what we would kind of want to see here is all of the sites being similar in 2017, but all the burn sites increasing in flowers after treatment. But actually what we've seen is in 2018 and 2019, burning appears to have very little effect on the number of native flowers present in these sites. And again, this is really early after restoration, and so it'll be interesting to continue following this over time. So now I want to show you when we look at subsets of that full plant community and just look at the species we seeded, we see a different story, which is really good news. So in 2017, the treatments were similar, except for that outlier of the 5-acre burn, probably driven by one flower species. But in 2018, directly following restoration, the burns presumably, and the fact that there was a drought that year, knocked back all the flowers, But by 2019, we can clearly see an increase in the number of those seeded flower species in our seeded plots, which shows that our seeding is working. All right, so I've now shown that the resources have not really changed, at least yet in the first 2 years post-restoration in these sites. So we then looked at how it affects the pollinators, because they may not only be responding to these resources that we were measuring. So before I jump in, I just wanted to remind you all that we had two different methods for capturing pollinators. The first is through pan trapping, which is that passive trapping method, which is a good method for seeing what's there. And then also through netting, which is a good method for capturing what's actually foraging and found on the flowers. So this first graph shows the number of pollinators caught in pan traps. And we found that there was not really any change pre-restoration to post-restoration. The treatments did not seem to have an effect at this point. But then when we looked at the effects of netting, we see a slightly different story. So pre-restoration, all the plots had similar numbers of pollinators. But then immediately after restoration, likely because of the fire coming in and disrupting these habitats, we see significantly fewer pollinators in the burned sites than in the control sites. But then by 2019, we actually see an increase in the number of pollinators at the seeded and burned sites compared to the other burned sites. And so this indicates to us that the sites are still changing. All right, so in some, we found that the pollinators are indeed responding to resource availability the way we would expect, but that the restored plots do not appear to be providing increased floral or nesting resources. This indicates that at this point in the restoration process, the restoration methods are not meeting their goals of increasing pollinator abundance or richness or creating distinct pollinator communities. However, I mentioned that we have gone out and collected information on the flower communities and the pollinators for the past couple of years. We just haven't processed the data yet. And so anecdotally, I want to just spend a couple minutes telling you about what we saw this past summer. So, you know, this past summer was very wet and it was a mass flowering year across all of Texas. So it was amazing to see what was happening at our sites. But something that was really cool was that we were starting to see for the first time these really distinct differences in the communities in every site that we went to. And this is really interesting because in a lot of restoration projects, it's known that it can take 3 to 5 years to start seeing the full effects of restoration, especially when restoration occurs in a drought year like we did. And the reason why I showed this picture, even though it's not just mass flowering, is because we started to see a number of our flower species in these sites that we specifically planted that we hadn't seen before. So it seems like this year, at the 4th year, we're starting to see that big change, probably also accelerated by all the water that we got this year. But then just to show some of these mass flowering pictures, this is one of our seeded sites as well. And you can see that in some of the sites this year, they looked like this, absolutely packed full of flowers, which they had never looked like before. And we got to the point where we would start, because we have so many different plots and sites that we don't always remember what the different treatments are, we would start guessing what they were, and we were right most of the time, guessing whether it was a burn site or a control site. So that's some good news, and hopefully I'll be able to share some more results with you all soon. But then one other final piece of this that I want to share is that it's really hard going through and pinning up all the many thousands of pollinators that we collect every year. But it's much easier to go through and count a specific group, like the bumblebees. So this year, after we saw such crazy flowering across our sites, I couldn't help myself. So we went through and we pulled out all the bumblebees from our sites, because bumblebees are one of our target species that's actually declining across Texas, we're really curious to see how they're being affected. So I do have 5 years of data for the bumblebees. And bumblebees are known to be very sensitive to these land changes. And the resources that are available across the landscape, they need a lot of resources because they have colonies. And so in 2017, we see that they have relatively similar abundances across all the treatments, as you would expect. But in 2018, they were really highly affected by the burning treatment. So it appears that the burning really knocked back their populations, likely because they're living in a lot of those grasses that were burned up. But then you start to see this gradual change over time until by 2021, even though this year we saw relatively low bumblebee abundances overall, we started seeing good numbers of bumblebees in our sites with that were seeded as well. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll be able to see even more of a change in this group. So there's a few implications for management from all this work. First, pollinator resources requirements vary by group. So it's important to clarify the resources necessary to support target populations. And really important for our project is don't expect immediate results when doing this kind of project over large spatial scales. Restoration famously can take years to establish, especially in areas like Texas that have really variable rainfall. And therefore, there's a need for more long-term monitoring to assess the success of any of these projects. Okay, so here at the end, I just want to talk a bit about what you can do. And we can talk a bit more about this in the questions too. So I really advocate for any people like you who are interested in native plants in doing any kind of restoration work you can, planting native plants in your own garden. So consider burning or mowing or removing invasive plants like King Ranch bluestem, and planting native flowering plants. And you can do this at large scales or you can do this at very small scales. So in my garden in Austin, I have ripped up everything and replanted it with native plants, hopefully to start restoring this pollinator habitat. And then also, it's a good idea, I'm sure all of you know this, but good to plant native plants because they're adapted to the local pollinators. So there are many pollinators that are specifically adapted to dealing with specific flower forms. They're also adapted to local weather, pests, and weeds, so they often require less maintenance. Oh, and something else interesting is that because many ornamental plants have been bred for things like large size or color, they don't necessarily have the same resources or the same pollen and nectar content that a lot of the native species do. I also recommend planting high diversity of flowers because this gives pollinators a healthier diet. And plants differ really significantly in the resources that they offer. So some bees are not able to, for example, visit asters, while other bees specifically only visit asters. So you want to have multiple types of flowers to cover the entire community. And then many pollinator species specialize on a single flower species or a very small number of flowers. So by increasing the number of species you have, you increase the chances that you're hitting those species. And then also higher diversity will bloom throughout the season because the worst scenario is that you have high flowering at one time of the year, increase the bee populations, but don't have anything to sustain them for the rest of the year. And then finally, I also recommend putting in pollinator nesting areas. And so you can find plants like these all over the web. But I also recommend in Texas, if you possibly can, leaving some area of your yard without grass or mulch, just leave it totally bare, often with a little bit of sand, because we have so many ground nesting bees that it's good to encourage them in areas like that. for the same reason, leaving small piles of litter in that kind of area for insects to nest in. So here at the end, I just wanted to give you some resources that you can visit. So the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation is a really good go-to. It's an NGO group, and they have lots of plans for bee hotels and pollinator gardens, and really good species lists online as well. And they just generally have a lot of resources for educators. So I would visit xerces.org. And then if you're interested in getting involved in the science at all, there's a number of community science projects that have sprung up to monitor pollinators, including the Great Sunflower Project, where you can, in your own garden, just observe one or two flowers and just send pictures or numbers of bees that you observe to this website. And they're collecting all this data and have been, I think, for the last 15 years. Bumblebee Watch, which is becoming increasingly important given all the declines in bumblebees around the country. So you send pictures of bumblebees to this app, and then experts will go in and identify them. And then finally, iNaturalist, which many of you are probably familiar with, is a community science app that you can upload pictures of pretty much everything you see, and it's being really heavily used by the bee community right now, the bee researcher community. And so with that, I'm pretty much done. I just want to thank all the people that made this possible, including all of our landowners that we work with, and all of the army of undergraduates that we work with every year to help us collect the insects and prepare the data. So with that,
questions.
yeah.
We have 75 people online.
Wow.
Zooming in, so.
All right.
I don't know if you guys here have questions, but one from online. What do you recommend to get rid of Bermuda for restoration?
Ooh, so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this because my whole yard is Bermuda grass, and talking to restoration people. And I know that we generally don't recommend doing this, but I found that the only thing that you can really do is use herbicide. And so you essentially just have to use a couple of rounds of Roundup to kill the Bermuda grass, and then really quickly put in plugs of grasses to smother any Bermuda grass that comes in. So really the best way is to shade out the grass.
What grass would you recommend?
Okay, stop. You repeat her question because they won't hear
sorry.
it.
What grasses would I recommend? I would recommend any good bunch grasses. Let's see. In my own garden, what I've been putting in is what's it called? The mealy. And then I've also been putting in plugs of side oats. Just I find around, just because it's pretty much anything to smother out the Bermuda grass to let the other seeds establish.
Okay, did any of these plots have grazing animals?
Yeah, so that's something that initially in the project we tried to control for, but it turns out that across Texas, it's not realistic and not really real to the landscape at all to not allow grazing. So really what we've done is worked with the land managers to keep the grazing to a low level. And then one of our collaborators, Eleanor, has specifically done a project kind of in parallel with this one, where she's now looking at the effects of grazing on some of these processes.
Okay, I've got another question. Does close mowing, like along highway easements, imitate bare ground and provide more area for insects?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's something that we've been looking at the Wildflower Center, just to see how mowing mimics burning in general.
Yes.
It looks like it does. It does change the communities. It's close to burning, but not quite there. So in terms of suppressing invasive species, it will, if you do it at the right times of the year, knock them back, but it won't lead to the kind of increases in forbs that you would see from burning.
Doesn't mowing, when they don't pressure wash the blades in between locations,
That could be really bad. Yes. Yeah, and then also just in general for nesting, if you're bringing the grass down, it's still not exposing that bare ground that the pollinators need. But that's still, it kind of comes back to an issue with the invasive grasses, because a lot of our native grasses are bunch grasses that actually have bare ground in between them.
Okay, request for the plant list, the 12 species that you seeded.
Yeah.
That's a slide back there, wasn't
Yep,
it?
I can go back to that. We can take pictures. I can also send information later. That'd be helpful.
Well, this will be recorded to go online, so that slide is in
Yeah.
your, yes. So that information will be in the recorded slide.
That's good,
All
because
right,
this is going backwards very slowly.
Okay.
And that seed mix is interesting because we've been seeing some of the species come up, but not all of them. So especially the milkweeds that we've planted have not seemed to be very successful.
Do you have a statistician for all these numbers? Do you want one?
I know it. Okay, it's not doing anything now.
Okay.
We kind of operate as statisticians ourselves, but statistics help is always appreciated.
You've got a volunteer on the chat here is what I'm.
Okay, here we go.
There's the
And
seed.
again, I'm sorry for the scientific names.
That's fine. They're, no.
We understand.
Yeah,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Some places prescribe burns, just something that you can't do. So have you looked at solarization in areas? And then the other question I have besides that is, in what you did, I know you looked at historical ways that the environment kind of reduced itself, but why did you not choose a reseeding without a burn?
Yeah, so the first question, no, we have not looked at, oh, sorry, I'm supposed to repeat this. Okay, so the question was, in many areas, burning is not allowed, especially in like neighborhoods and communities. So asking if we've used solarization, right, to control the plant communities, and the answer is no, we haven't. One thing that I would worry about with that would be affecting the populations of insects that are already there, because presumably that would affect deeper into the soil or affect anything that would come up. Done any of that, and if we did it in a patchy way, I think that method would actually work really well. Anything that kind of kills that top layer of plants, I think, would help. The second question was why we did not include a seeding and without burning. And I think that just wasn't within the scope of the original project. I need to think about that one more because I wasn't here when they did that initial restoration, so I should actually ask.
Okay, any more questions from in here? Oh, look.
Yes.
It's a forest.
Not only how to get rid of Bermuda, how to get rid of KR blue.
Oh my God. Okay, well what I presented here is just half of my postdoc work. The project I've been working on the most is through the Wildflower Center, using this 20-year data set where they've been doing burns and mows at different times of the year. And what we found is that the best way to get rid of KR bluestem is to disrupt its growth in the summer when it's setting seed. And so the absolute best way to suppress them is just to burn during the summer. It's amazing how little KR bluestem we have just from burning in the hot months, but that's not really practical for a lot of people. So what we recommend for knocking back the KR bluestem is mowing in the summer as well. It's not as good as burning, but it's a lot better than doing nothing.
Like August?
Yes, yeah, talking July, August, and September. Any later than basically, yeah, just not during the growing season in the winter. The absolute worst thing is to burn or mow in the winter. So if you do that, then the KR explodes. And so some of our plots at the Wildflower Center where we do winter burning are all just KR blue stem. Yeah.
If there's a city that has some parkland that we would like to restore, what type of resources could we contact or advise?
Yeah.
Monitoring possibly.
Yeah, so I've been looking into this a bit because I've been mostly working with the Fish and Wildlife for doing our burns, but I don't know as much about like doing small scale burns and small scale restoration. But it looks like online a good place to go is the Noble Foundation. Which has information about burning and can connect you with people. Also, the NRCS has some programs for helping fund some of these projects and getting them established. And then I found out yesterday, because I was emailing some colleagues about this, that some areas actually have burning co-ops that you can contact for getting some of this information. Another thing that you can do, I believe, is contact the Wildflower Center and ask them what they recommend in terms of getting connected to people.
Okay, any position in particular at the Wildflower Center?
I will think about it. Yeah, I know that our burn boss, knows all the people in the area, but I'm not sure how open everyone is to answering questions.
This burn's going to be a real hard sell on city property.
Yeah, and that's something that we're encountering all over. I think that stuff is starting to change. So maybe after the talk we can talk, and I'll give you my email. And yeah.
I have a question about. You probably didn't see it because it's probably already dark, but there's this big, large greenbelt area just to this side of the community center. And they mow it to about 2 or 3 inches. And people don't go out on it.
Yeah.
They got a no trespassing sign. And it's when I moved here 25 years ago, it had lovely wildflowers all the time. Now it's this pretty much dead looking area. Except for certain areas in the green belt where there are some junipers and other wildflowers. What can you do to educate people to follow the Texas Department of Transportation guidelines to mow no lower than 4 inches along urban highways and no lower than 7 inches along rural highways, or not mow at all when you can?
Yeah, the question is how to change mowing culture across Texas, because mowing will suppress a lot of the wildflowers and
rattlesnakes hide in high grass.
I know. And so some mowing is good, obviously, for encouraging growth, but too much mowing isn't good. I don't know. This is something that we're thinking about a lot, is how to change that culture in general. Because we see, related to this, out in many parts of the country, there's horse ranches with, mowed grass or short invasive grasses across the whole thing. And it'd be amazing to be able to bring some more wildflowers back. I think that the best way is probably to keep showing people that it is beautiful, not just to have, this grass, but also high diversity of flowering plants. I think that many areas in Texas have done a really good job of that with the Roadsides Initiative. I think that people really respond to that. But beyond that, I'm not sure. It's an ongoing problem. Yeah.
You're with the Ladywood Johnson
Yeah.
wildflower? Okay. So I went onto the wildflower.org and saw that there are some seed availability
Mhm.
through the wildflower.org, NMAR, I
Uh-huh.
think. It gives a whole caption of what it is and all these things. I'm trying to get a hold of somebody for the seeds there
Uh-huh.
through that organization. Don't know who to contact specifically to say,
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I know that they sell bags of seed in the in like the gift shop there.
yeah, I'm talking about specific seeds though.
Yeah.
On that website that said there are seeds available through this piece.
Right. So is this for who is this for? For
So
like
this
do you need a
really-
lot of the
so I'll be
seeds?
doing honeybees.
Uh-huh.
It's my ag stuff.
Uh-huh.
And so I'll be doing 8 boxes, colonies
Uh-huh.
for April, May timeframe.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm planting pollinator plants all around that area.
Right.
Which is, I'm really glad I got to go to this meeting tonight, your brief. And try to understand what are I'm in the Blackland Prairie
Yeah.
area. So I've identified those plants that are
Yeah.
native to that area.
Yeah.
But there are certain seeds that aren't available commercially, but they are on the wildflower.
Interesting.
And saying, hey, we have these seeds,
Yeah.
and here's the numbers associated with this, and
Interesting.
contact this person by
Okay.
email, which I've done. And
So have you looked at Native American seed also?
yeah, I've looked at, I bought
Okay.
from them.
Gotcha.
There's specific seeds I'm going for. Those are identified on the wildflower
Yeah.
as to special value to honeybees.
Okay.
They're
Gotcha.
identified as that.
Yeah.
Those are the ones I'm looking at that are native to Blackland Prairie.
Gotcha.
So I want those specific seeds.
Right. Well, I don't know who is actually selling them. I know that our seed expert at the Wildflower Center is Minette Marr.
That's what it is.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And so she, at the very least, can point you towards the person to talk to and the seeds to get. She's the botanist expert there.
Okay.
And I have some seeds here tonight that are harvested from Berry Springs. They're all native plants. If you want to come take a look at them,
Please.
if you have, a lot of these are good for bees.
Yeah.
And we're giving away plants to everybody who attended over here, and they're good pollinator plants too. Okay, guys, it's 8:15 and we have to be out of here at 8:30. So with the
All right,
room
thank
back
you all for
and
coming.
everything. So, thank you.